Welcome back to part 7 of my project to build a replica Kar 98. In part 6, I had shaped the forend of the stock, fit the bayonet lug and middle band, and made the handguard. I had said that the next step was to make the nose cap, but there's a few things to take care of before I get to that. There's no front sight, and the barrel is slightly longer than I'd like. I've heard conflicting information regarding the exact barrel length of the Kar 98. Some sources say 440 millimeters, and some say 450. Since I'm not building an exact replica here, I'm going to go with an approximation. In other words, what looks right. The length of the forend, and as a result, the barrel length, will be determined by the bayonet. With it fit to the rifle, I want the muzzle flush with the crossguard. I'll mark that. So I'll cut the barrel here, and after that, I'll have to recrown it. I'll remove the bayonet. And since the stock shaping is done, I'll get the rifle stripped down to just a barreled action. With the barrel in the vise, I'll run a cleaning patch from the chamber end down the bore. With the patch just barely short of the muzzle, this will prevent any chips from making their way down the bore too far, and also make it easy to push them out. I'll get to cutting. The resulting cut needs some cleaning up. It needs to be square to the end of the barrel, and the crown needs to be recut. This is a perfect job for the lathe. Or it would be, if it fit. The end of the barrel is within the chuck, meaning that it won't be able to square it here. I'll have to come up with another way. I have a collet block set up in the mill. I'll slide the barrel into it. Then I can tighten it down. With the mill, I can easily cut the end of the barrel square. Here I really wish I had a machinist jack, but these will help support the receiver during the cut. Without being able to fit it in the lathe, I also have no easy way of chamfering the outside of the barrel. Instead, I'll use a file by hand to put a very small chamfer all the way around. And with no lathe, I also have no easy way of crowning the barrel, which is chamfering the inside of the bore and removing the burrs that you see here. I've seen this technique before for crowning with limited tooling. I'm not going to cut a crown. Instead, I'm going to grind, or more accurately lap, the crown. To do so, I'll use this panhead screw and a drill. I'll spin it against the crown straight on like this, and also work it around like so. Let's get started. While I lap the crown, I want to remind you that this is not intended to be a very accurate rifle, especially when it's shooting an overpowered 8mm Mauser cartridge through a short 18-inch barrel. So while some of you may be cringing watching me do this to a muzzle, please keep that in mind. And if this doesn't work, or doesn't meet my very low accuracy standards, I can always recut this better in the future, whether that's with a bigger lathe, or with a specialty reamer. And now that I'm done with the crown, let's take a look at the results. This actually looks really good. I'm surprised this worked as well as it did. The chamfer is even all around, both where there is rifling and where there isn't. But like I said earlier, the real test will be when this rifle is shot. But until then, I still have a lot more work to do. Next, I'll tackle the front sight. For that, I have another barreled action. This is actually how I got the bolt for the Kar98. I'll modify this front sight to work with my project, but first, I'll remove the sight blade. Then I'll remove the sight itself. I can't just fit the sight onto the Kar98 barrel, since it's much bigger. I also can't turn the barrel down, since again, it doesn't fit into my lathe. And I also can't cut off the ring and solder this directly to the barrel. That's because the longer Vizier rear sight is taller than the K98K style sight. To get this shooting on target later, I'll need to make the height of the front sight match that of the rear. I'm going to calculate the height over the bore. To do that, I'll measure the height of the sight at the notch, then the barrel diameter at that point. Then at the front, I'll measure the barrel, then the sight base, and finally the sight blade. I'll use these measurements to calculate the height over the bore. Ideally, I want the height at the front to equal that at the rear, for the sights to be accurate at relatively close range. For the rear, I'll take the height of the sight minus half the barrel diameter. The height of the bore is 0.953 inches. For the front, the height of the base plus the height of the sight blade plus half the barrel diameter equals a height over bore of 0.932 inches. So if I were to simply cut off the ring and attach the sight base to the barrel, it will be too short. I'll have to find a way of increasing the height, and I'll also need to cut away the ramp part of the sight so that it fits entirely within the nose cap. Then I'll mill everything flat. I milled chamfers on either end because I'll be welding in a spacer to make the sight taller. I'll cut off the excess material, then clean it up on the mill. You may be thinking, why go through all of this trouble of modifying the front sight instead of just making a new one? Well, it's because of the dovetail for the sight blade. It's tiny, and I don't have a cutter small enough to duplicate it. I do want this to be compatible with standard Mauser sight blades, in case I need to replace it later on down the road. Now with the front sight squared up, I'll remove some material from the bottom of it. This will set the height of the front sight. I'll measure the height of it. Then I'll change the setup on the mill to one that I used earlier. I'll add the collet block. And then the barrel. I'll be cutting a small flat on the end of the barrel for the front sight base. I'll make sure that the barreled action is level with the mill to ensure that the flat I'm cutting is level as well. This looks good. I'll tighten the collet. Then double check that nothing moved. Then I can start the cut. The front sight base should fit within this small slot. That looks good. Now I can remove the action from the mill and get it set up in the vise. I'll measure the height to see if my calculations are correct. 1.04 plus the sight blade minus half the barrel diameter. And that's just a few thousandths over the height of the rear sight, 0.960 compared to 0.953. Any fine tuning needed later on can be done by filing down the front sight post. I'll solder on the front sight base, starting with tinning the barrel. I already have the sight base tinned. Now I'll solder these together. With the sight attached, I'll clean up the barrel with steel wool and oil. I cut down the width of the sight blade so that it doesn't interfere with the nose cap. I'll add it to the sight base. The last thing to do with the sights is to double check that they're aligned, which they are. Next I'll add back on the stock. I added the stock back on in order to tackle the cleaning rod. Instead of making one from scratch, I bought this. It was labeled as a generic Mauser 98 cleaning rod, which has the exact same end as the Kar 98 rod. It's long, however, and likely as on the long rifles, it's meant to fit within the deep channel cut into the stock. But if you remember in a previous video, I had added a cleaning rod retainer at the front of the bayonet lug. This will screw in just enough to hold it in place, but it is the wrong thread size. I'll have to cut the rod shorter and rethread the end. To do so, I'll chuck into the lathe. Then I'll set up the parting tool to cut off the excess. Next, I'll reduce the diameter at the end slightly to be able to cut the threads. The die cuts small threads much better than I can manage single point cutting. Here's how short the cleaning rod is now. Next, I'll test fit it on the rifle. The tip of the cleaning rod is just behind the front sight, just like in reference photos. The real test will be if the bayonet fits over it. It does. And the crosscut is exactly even with the end of the barrel cut earlier. I know I say this with every video, but this is looking more and more like a Kar 98, especially now that there's one defining feature left, the nose cap. I'll make that in the next video. But for now, the front end is fully prepared for that one last addition. I had originally planned on making it in this video, but I underestimated the number of steps that it took to get to this point. The cutting of the barrel, the front sight, and the cleaning rod are all smaller pieces, but with maybe the exception of the latter, they're all required steps before the nose cap can be made. I'll get to that in the next video. Until then, thank you for following along, and thanks for watching.